good to see you all after a month of being away. It feels good to be back in my own bed, back in our own sanctuary, back with you all. But it was a great sabbatical, and I can't say thank you enough for the opportunity. I can't thank you enough for the opportunity to go. A lot of people picked up some extra roles that I normally do so that I can have a sabbatical, and I am very thankful for that. I think all of you had something to do with my being able to go on sabbatical, but definitely Jeff and Ashley and the others that filled the pulpit while I was gone. Lisa picked up extra duties in the office. There were several that stepped up, like Mike being and agreed to be the point person if different things happened to occur while I was gone. And bottom line, it was just great to be able to be away and have the trust and confidence not to worry while I was gone. Not to fret. Not being on Facebook for an entire month kind of helped, because I had no idea what you did while I was gone. I actually ended up deleting all of my social media apps from my phone just because it was too tempting standing in line somewhere to push the button and see what's Mary West doing today. So thank you very much. Trying to share what sabbatical is like is very hard. If you've been to church camp, or if you've had one of those amazing once-in-a-lifetime vacations, or if you've had a special vacation Bible school experience, you know when you're telling people about it, you can't just show them the pictures, you can't just tell them the stories. At some point you find yourself saying, you just had to be there, right? You had those. Sabbatical is something like that. What I can tell you, I didn't realize until I was on sabbatical how little I was dreaming until after about a week into sabbatical, my dream life just kind of exploded, and I started writing down the names of the people that were showing up in my dreams every night and what was happening. A lot of it doesn't make sense. As dream life usually is, your subconscious is working through all kinds of things, past, present, and future, but it was so much more vivid on my sabbatical than it was leading up to sabbatical. Another thing that I can tell you, working with groups like our discernment team, before I went on sabbatical, while I could see that we have a bright future, and I was very excited about that, I was struggling to come up with details to suggest, or to wish for, or to dream about. Well, I have pages now of all kinds of, the discernment team may be a little worried, but I have all kinds of pages of drawings and lists and diagrams and ideas of where I can see us moving in the next 6 months to 6 years. It's very, very exciting. A big part of sabbatical was eating. We ate a lot. This is a picture of the first thing that Joseph and I saw when we entered Canada. Went through customs, first thing, McDonald's. What else should you see when you're in another country? But to know that you're not in another country, but you're still back home. Mealtime was so much fun on sabbatical. We didn't eat much McDonald's, by the way. That was just kind of... Oh, the other funny thing about being in Canada, it's not often that my speedometer gets to look like this. How often can you have your kid in the car and you're doing 115? I don't know, my insurance agent was to know that I was doing 115, but it was kilometers, so it was a little misnomer. I don't get to see my speedometer do that, so we had to send a picture of it. So mealtime became sort of a magical experience, whether it was Joseph and I trying exotic foods like hamburger made out of lamb, or lasagna made with wild boar. He tried that. He actually ate it too fast for me to try and steal a bite, so I didn't really get a chance. Sometimes it was eating meals with people that I know as colleagues but don't get to see very often. Sometimes it was eating with people that I had just met. Sometimes it was living in silent retreat on the west side of St. Louis in a community that lives that way all the time, and eating my meals in a hermitage all by myself every day. Sometimes it was eating a meal in a silent retreat with other people who were on a silent retreat, so we weren't talking to each other, but our mealtime was shared in the same room as sort of this silent community sharing our meal. Mealtime is so much more than the food. If you ask Joseph and I about our favorite meals on this trip, or if you think about your favorite meals on a vacation or a holiday or through the year, how often is that special meal about the food that's on the table, or how much is it about something other? The people that were at the table, or the conversation, or where you were geographically. There's so much more to being fed than just that spoon going in the mouth. Which is part of the reason I picked today's text. Oddly enough, in the first service, listening to Barb Small read the text, I heard something that I just had read over the top of for years and never really noticed. Right before this meeting happens in the Gospel of Matthew, John the Baptist is killed. So Jesus hears about John's execution and he goes off. Jesus goes off to be by himself and to pray and to spend time with God for spiritual renewal. The very next verse, it says, when the crowd heard this, they followed him on land. And I've always read that as, when the crowd heard that Jesus went off on his own, they followed him on land. And there's lots of reasons to read it that way. But what if you read that text as, and when the crowds heard that John the Baptist had died, they too followed Jesus. Are they following Jesus in search of community because of their common loss? They share this loss of John the Baptist, who maybe many of them had gone to the River Jordan to hear him preach and to be inspired by his word, and he has been executed. And so in their grief and mourning, they're seeking out that other kind of community. And so they go to Jesus to find that. How often do we in our own suffering seek that kind of community and provide it, that godly community? Whether it's a funeral luncheon after the funeral is over where we go to have that godly community with other people of faith to share our mourning. Or when one of us is sick and suffering or after surgery and their small group will take them a casserole to make certain that their mealtime is provided. Mealtime being so much more than the food on the dish. Totally, for me, a different light of reading this scripture text. That wasn't in the sermon prep, but I shared it with the Nutty Pot crowd. I thought I'd share it with you all. I found it amazing when Barb read that, and I suddenly thought, oh yeah, what if the crowd responded to John's death and not Jesus' own trip to solitude? And it supports the sermon, so I also want to add it for that. Because sabbatical, our life together in community, is so much about being fed, and yet so much more than that. Sometimes we look at this text and we look at what Jesus is doing. Sometimes we look at what the disciples are doing. But if we look at what the crowd is doing in this text, in some way the crowd is treating this as a Sabbath experience. Whether it's the month-long sabbatical or the Sunday Sabbath, the Saturday Sabbath, using your daily prayer and study time as Sabbath time. Sabbath, a time of rest, a time of breaking your routine to make room for God to break into your life. Sabbath. In a way, the crowd is on Sabbath. Literally, they're in the wilderness, which is a great context. If we look at the Celtic vision of who the Holy Spirit is, this wild goose that leads us on a chase, or sometimes chases us to help our soul connect with God, the wilderness is a fantastic place for that kind of dance. Because in the wilderness, while it's dangerous, it's full of creative potential. There's no boundaries. There's no given expectations. It is the wilderness. It is not home. It is the Wizard of Oz. Right? We're not in Kansas anymore. The wilderness. So the crowd is on Sabbath. They are in the wilderness. And then in the wilderness, they get to experience a mealtime that is so much more satisfying than simply the hunger of the stomach. Part of that is because while they're on Sabbath, while they are in this wilderness, they are experiencing the fruits of discernment. The disciples are acting democratically, right? They've taken a vote. And as a pragmatic group of individuals, the disciples have voted, there's not enough food here, so we should send these people over there where there's food. And they've gone to Jesus, their leader, and shared the results of their democratic voice, and they've said, this is the pragmatic way to do it. it's reasonable, right? If you don't have enough where you are, it's helpful if you go to where there is, and then you can be fed. But the fault in their democratic effort, not all, but in theirs, is that they were only thinking about the food on the plate, right? They had reduced this moment to the stuff, the physicality of eating. Part of discernment is listening to that voice of God that we hear in prayer, the voice of others who are mentors to us, the voice of those who have sort of a prophetic presence in our life, the voice of others who are more wise than us. And so part of discernment for the disciples was listening to Jesus say, you feed them. And because the disciples listened to Jesus say, you feed them, they experienced a meal sharing far greater than just the meal on the plate. Some ways that we read this text could be that Jesus magically takes 7 items, 5 fish, 5 loaves of bread, whichever way it goes, and turns it into this amazing buffet that is all you can eat, never ending, with much left. That's one way to read it. Another way to read it is that Jesus takes this initial offering, this initial generosity, this gracious giftedness of these 7 items, and uses that to inspire the community to miraculously be as generous. If you take your child, your loved one, your best friend, yourself into the wilderness, you're hiking, you're at the zoo, rarely do you go without either a provision to eat or the means to get something to eat. True? Most reasonable, responsible parents will do that. Most of us on our own would do that. We don't just wander off with, unless you're following Jesus in Luke chapter 10, usually you go off with something. It's reasonable to expect that this crowd that has showed up in the wilderness to be with Jesus in community has brought something to feed their screaming, cranky self and child. So the initial 7 items offered, Jesus uses those to inspire the community to do this miraculous sharing that they might not otherwise experience. How often in our workaday world might we expect that kind of generosity? Hopefully, but not always. Not always. But in this community, part of the miracle is not just that they shared so that everyone was fed. They shared so that everyone was fed and there was more. So now, because of their experience of discernment on Sabbath in the wilderness, they've gone from having sort of this pragmatic, physical mealtime was only about the food and the calories experience, which is driven by scarcity. There's not enough food. To an experience of meal sharing is something so much more and leads to abundance. Because in some of the tellings of the story, there's an emphasis on, and not only did everybody have enough to eat, there were baskets of food left over. When initially there was not enough. But to get to these 2 great experiences, the crowd had to take that journey. The least productive week on my sabbatical was the week I spent in my house. Because in my house I was distracted by laundry and the cleaning and walking the dog, and when I went away is where I was able to be in the wilds enough, to be free enough of my regular routine. Part of the reason we tend to worship more in this room than we do in our own homes is because coming to this room leaves our own homes behind and frees us to be in God's house and experience God's presence. It's a journey. Rarely do we have these amazing experiences unless we take a journey. Even the journey of inviting a guest to your own house can create enough chaos to provide for creative potential for new things to happen. Imagine what those new things could in 6 months, in 6 years. I am so glad to be back. Because with you, I had great community. I had wonderful worship experiences when I was on sabbatical. It's always fun to go to somebody else's church. Got a couple extra sermons in my pocket now that somebody else preached. Realistically, though, I had some amazing, it's fun to see how somebody else does it and just learn from them. Or the worship times that I had on my own on silent retreat were just profoundly meaningful to me for spiritual renewal. But there is nothing like coming home to worship with your home community, with the people that we share the vocabulary, we share the songs, we share worship each week as we journey through life together. Thank you for letting me to be away, and thank you for welcoming me home. Amen. Mr. Wolf is praying for us today. He's going to help us come to the Lord in prayer and help us share that prayer that Jesus